Well, yesterday we began with our introduction to the book of Colossians, and I talked a little bit about the background and the setting for the book. What I want to really look at now today is what the message was. And I think it's very important that when we begin reading any book of the Bible, we have to understand that there was really ultimately a message or a theme, a point that the writer wanted to be made. And that's even true if we'd say for the historical books of the Old Testament or the books of the law. They weren't just, automatic writing, like the Spirit grabbed them and they just began to write and they didn't know what they were writing. God had formulated a very clear thought process, and there was something very clearly theologically and intellectually that was being developed. And that's because in the spiritual life, the real battle is for what goes on between your ears. It's a battle for the mind, battle for the brain, that somehow we have to believe something in order to act upon it. And so you can always tell what people believe by their actions. So that when, for example, a politician like Nancy Pelosi says, well, it's all about the kids, it's all about the kids, it's all about the kids. And then she throws all of her energy behind the furtherance and the promotion of abortion, you realize that her words don't match her actions. So the sad fact about all of us is that we can mouth words that sometimes don't line up with our actions. And that's where Paul was very, very concerned. And it seemed like his first and foremost thought was the entrance of teachings that weren't biblical into the church. Now, I've mentioned this many times, that every letter of the New Testament, every book of the Old Testament, including Jesus, or New Testament, including Jesus' Gospels, dealt with the issue of false doctrine. Because if you have true doctrine, you're always going to have the enemy creating a false narrative. He creates false narratives to take us away from the true narrative. And so the choice that we make many times as Christians, even after we're saved, is which is going to be the prevailing narrative of my life? Is it going to be a biblical narrative? Am I going to see my life in this world in the light of what Scripture says it is and should be? Or am I going to buy into the narrative of the culture? And the problem is that the cultural narratives oftentimes are pretty seductive. I mean, they can, in a way, they promise us that we can have our cake and eat it as well, which we know intuitively, instinctively, we know intellectually that's not possible, yet at the same time we want it to be true. So when Satan deceived Eve and he said, eat of the fruit that God said don't eat of it, not only will you not die, but you'll become like God. The end result was that she ate of the fruit that God had forbidden, and not only did death come, not immediately, but it came eventually. She didn't realize that she was sowing the DNA of death into the human organism. But in addition to that, she only knew the difference between good and evil, but didn't have the power to resist the evil, nor the power to consistently do the good. And so basically that half-truth has brought condemnation upon the planet. Well, I won't continue to go into that whole plan of God conversation. But Paul was very concerned about these Gentiles who did not have the foundation of the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament theology is the same as the New Testament theology. It just approaches it from a different direction. As someone once said years ago, I heard it many times, my pastor used to repeat it, that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. So you'll find that if something is biblically true, you can trace it from Genesis to Revelation. There will be a consistency, and you'll find that it'll prove itself through. So if we, for example, talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, we're going to see the doctrine of the Trinity not only spoken of in the New Testament, which it is repeatedly, but also in the Old Testament, and it is also to be found there in many places. So what were exactly the false teachings that Paul was having to confront or wanting to confront in Colossia? Well, we don't know exactly, but listen to how he describes them in chapter 2. He says, I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. Boy, I tell you, talking about really encapsulating the kind of dynamic we deal with today, we've learned how to put sound-fighting arguments into sound bites, and people, my body, my life, my choice, that kind of stuff. And yet you sit there and break it down and you realize scientifically the baby is not your body. It's a distinct body. You didn't conceive that child by your choice. You conceived that child by basically the will of God. And basically it's not your decision to destroy that child. that becomes, when you take a life unjustifiably, that is murder. And I don't say that to put guilt on women who have had abortions. I realize that probably 1 out of 4 people listening to me, or ladies listening to me, have gone through that. But at the same time, we have to be healed of the guilt and the shame that we feel and remorse we feel because of those actions. We have to be willing to confess them. We have to be willing to say that was wrong and I sinned and Father, forgive me. And so when he says, watch out for fine sounding arguments, he's essentially telling you need to step back for a moment and really listen and deconstruct some of those arguments and see if they really hold water. Because as Paul goes on, he says, so then, just as you received Jesus Christ as Lord, continue to live in him. So what you experienced in the beginning when the gospel was presented to you and who he was presented, the gospel of goodness, the gospel of grace. It was a gracious God who calls us to live a moral, upright life. And he says, you learned that when you first came to Christ. Now people are coming in and trying to dissuade you, either by saying there's things you need to do to keep your salvation, or even saying it's all right to commit certain kinds of sins. God doesn't care. Those are the two most obvious and frequent false doctrines that are out there. But he says, you were rooted and built up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught. And then he goes on in chapter 2 and verse 8 to say, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. Now, the human tradition refers to the value system of the world. It's value system. In other words, when I came to Christ, my parents invested certain values in me. Some of them were biblical in their orientation or origins, and others were unbiblical. I mean, my father, bless his heart, would tell me, never admit you're wrong and never say you're sorry. I find the Bible teaches something quite different, and I found very early in my life that, that was not a really workable philosophy, even if you wanted to have any friends or happiness. So, but nonetheless, that was a tradition that he had grown up and he passed on to me. And they also said that there are things that line up with the basic principles of this world, not with Christ. So right away, we began to realize that there are some value systems and patterns of behavior that may be comfortable and familiar to us because they're what we've grown up. But when we come to Christ, Christ is calling us to separate ourselves and to allow the Holy Spirit to free us from those traditions because they're false. In fact, what he goes on to say as he gets further into chapter 3 and chapter 4, he's going to talk about living out your faith in the context of your daily life. We have terms theologically that we use. We call orthodoxy, which means something that's consistent with the teaching or the doctrine of the church. And then out of that should come orthopraxy. And orthopraxy means behavior, practice, if you will, that's consistent with what the Bible teaches, what the doctrine of the church is. And Paul was really concerned with this because he realized that if Christians lived in a non-Christian way, if they didn't really show any change in their life, there would be no power in their testimony. That we often think that the key to the growth of the church was going out and doing signs and wonders and miracles. Well, we find even in the book of Acts that it certainly drew a crowd when people were healed and miracles took place. But in some places, as soon as they realized that the miracle also required that you receive Christ and reject the old gods and change your manner of life, give up your immoralities, those same people turned around despite the miracles and sought to kill the apostles. And we need to understand it's the change of life that really is the powerful testimony. It takes longer, but its roots go deeper as it begins to transform the culture. Remember, I was talking yesterday about how slavery changed everything. Or slavery was changed ultimately in the world because of Paul's emphasis upon the dignity of a slave and the accountability the slave master was going to have in the sight of God. That essentially most people would say, I better love this man or woman like I would my own children, which is what the Old Testament taught about treating slaves, that you should treat them as family members, not as people who are burdened. Well, I don't have time to go into the dynamics of what slavery is like in the Old Testament, but it was far different than what existed in this country prior to the Civil War, but we won't get into that right now. But again, Paul says a couple things, and I'll try to wrap it up with this. What he says in verse 8 of chapter 3 is, rid yourself of all of these things. What are these things? Anger, rage, malice, Malice, anger is that boiling inside. Rage is that explosion of my anger outwardly. Malice is that scheming and planning to get even. A slander is using every opportunity to diminish that person by words in the eyes of other people. And filthy language from your lips. It's amazing to me that I've known pastors who will use pretty profane language as if somehow that's spiritual. So anyway, they got the liberty. But he says, Paul said, those things shouldn't even be part of your vocabulary. He says, and do not lie to each other. And he goes on, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy, dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And then finally, he goes on and begins to hit the really kind of what I call the marketplace of life, really where the relational dynamics we live out every day, where he talks about wives and husbands, about children and their parents. He talks about slaves and masters. And he says in verse 5 of chapter 4, be wise in the way you act towards others. And wise means to do it in agreement with the heart and the will and nature of God, and make the most of every opportunity. Don't waste time doing frivolous, meaningless things. Always have in mind, how can this build into a relationship? Which I think does include things like fun and conversation and play and games and eating nice dinners together. Because he's not saying that we don't do things that are fun, but he's saying we do them recognizing that they have inherently a redemptive value, a way to build into the life of others. And he says, so clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, gentleness, and patience. And he says, and let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Such great sage wisdom. We don't have enough time to go into them anymore in detail, but we'll pick up the conversation tomorrow. So I want to begin basically deconstructing verse 1, and there's some really fascinating things that we can see just in the opening statements that Paul makes in this letter. So picking this up tomorrow, blessings, and looking forward to it. I don't know if you can tell, I'm really kind of jazzed about studying this book. So thanks for listening. God bless you.